Nearly 250 British servicemen were killed in the Falklands campaign. Argentina's forces had the most modern armaments. But who supplied Argentina with these weapons?
Here's a photograph of anti-aircraft ammunition captured from Argentine troops at Goose Green.
Yeah.
Would that be the type of ammunition that might have brought you down?
It could well have been. I think there's a good chance it was that.
Did you know that this ammunition came from England?
No, I didn't, in fact.
Tonight, we examine how Britain herself supplied arms and ammunition to a nation that became her enemy. The Falklands crisis, which began a year ago this week, was, of course, over Argentina's claims to the Falklands, to South Georgia, and the South Sandwich Islands down here. The Franks report, published a few weeks ago, discloses that for more than 6 years, Argentina indicated that she might use force to recover the territories. Yet, over all this period, Britain herself sold arms to Argentina. Tonight, we look at two themes: Argentina's energetic pursuit of her claim, as set out in the Franks report, and British arms sales to Argentina, as shown dramatically by the weapons captured from Argentinian troops in the Falklands. But we begin with a decision taken by Harold Wilson's government. The investigation is by Ed Harriman.
This is Britain's first Type 42 destroyer, HMS Sheffield. Britain allowed Argentina to buy one Type 42 to modernize her navy and helped her to build a second. Tony Killick of William and Glynn's Bank in the city was involved in financing the deal with Argentina.
The Type 42 destroyer was a new design in the late 60s. It had been designed for the Royal Navy, and they'd placed the first order. It carried a Sea Dart weapon fit, Lynx helicopter, anti-submarine missile system.
And in effect, Britain was selling the best ships that it had to Argentina at that time.
Yes, it was.
How would you describe the government's attitude towards the territorial claim against the Falklands?
I don't think it was ever raised at all. Certainly never raised in my presence.
Britain's Ministry of Defence has to vet all British arms exports. Didn't the ministry think that while Argentina was claiming the Falklands, selling warships to her was a bit risky? We talked to Sir Frank Cooper, who was the senior civil servant at Defence during the Falkland crisis. He explained that in the early 1970s, Britain expected Argentinian pinpricks, but nothing more.
It was much more seen, I think, over a period of time as relatively small-scale incidents of one kind or another, but not a major invasion. But it's important, I think, to take aboard that the British government, successive British governments, did not sell equipment which would be directly related to a major aggression, such as landing craft or things of that kind, which were turned down over the years.
Assuming no major attack was likely, Britain tried to market more warships to Argentina and successfully sold her aircraft parts and military electronics. Officials had no doubts about the general policy. Did you think that it was generally a good thing to be selling arms to Argentina?
As a nation, we shall only survive by selling our industrial goods. And in those goods are arms of various kinds on the basis that countries have got a right of self-defense. So you've got to try and strike this very difficult balance. Broadly speaking, I think it's done fairly well.
But let's look at one weapon. Lethal, relatively cheap. The French made it. Britain supplied essential parts. It's the Exocet.
The Naval Armaments Exhibition near Paris late last year. A few £1,000s spent on champagne and canapes at this fete can help Aerospatiale, the French makers of Exocet, land orders worth millions. But vital parts of the Exocet have always been made not in France, but in Britain. At the exhibition, we talked to Pierre Condon, editor of a Swiss arms magazine. He spelt out Britain's role.
British components in the Exocet missiles are mainly the radome. This is this sophisticated fairing, transparent to microwave emissions that you can see here. Then, in the homing head itself, you have one of the most important part is the magnetron. Then, under the missile, to keep the missile above the water, you have a radio altimeter, a Part of this radio altimeter is subcontract to British firms.
So you're saying that the British components play an important role in the Exocet's performance?
Yes, surely. Actually, the missile can't fly to the target without those components.
We now look at British policy on the selling of the Exocet to places like Argentina. Sir Frank Cooper.
Did Britain have any control over French sales of Exocets to third parties?
None at all.
Could they have had?
I don't think they could. You can only really get control if you have a collaborative venture. This was not a collaborative venture.
Exocets in their distinctive square-ribbed pods cost over £500,000 apiece. About 17% of each missile is made in Britain. The Royal Navy, a major customer, bought 300 of them, but Britain had no control where the others went. This was a crucial defense weakness, for Britain's own countermeasures against the missile were underdeveloped. Is it right to say that many British warships lacked adequate and effective defenses against the Exocet?
I think British warships were not as properly defended against the Exocet type of missile as one would have expected. In the 1980s and 1990s, but I mean they are much better defended now.
Well, wasn't it a bit risky then, not have control over the sale of Exocets, and to have Exocets sold to Argentina, which had a territorial claim against Britain?
There's no way in which you could have got control of this kind. The fact is that if we hadn't manufactured these components, we're talking really about very small components. Somebody else would have manufactured them in France or some other country.
In Argentinian hands, the Exocet was deadly. On the Sheffield, 20 men died. On Atlantic Conveyor, 12 died. HMS Glamorgan was also struck by an Exocet. It hit her helicopter flight deck. Lieutenant David Tinker was at action stations here. He was killed. Hugh Tinker, his father, is a former professor of politics and history. He has criticisms of Britain's policy on the sale of arms.
In the past, there has been much more careful control over the receivers of arms. If one goes back years, they used only to be sold to our Commonwealth partners and to known allies. Now the sale seems quite indiscriminate.
But what about the argument, if we don't sell other countries' arms, other countries will?
Well, that's the same as arguing if I don't sell a guy marijuana, somebody else will.
But it keeps thousands of people employed.
Probably the most prosperous country in the world, Japan, does not trade in arms. Until very recently, West Germany also had a complete ban on the sale of arms overseas. I don't think there is a clear correlation between national prosperity and trading in arms.
The crowd at the French exhibition have little time for economic theory. In the short term, as they see it, arms mean money. And if the British complain about where France sells Exocets to, the French can always point out that Britain herself is in the business. How do you feel about the fact that at least 40 British servicemen lost their lives due to Exocet?
As you know, we are friends. Great Britain and France are friends, and Great Britain has Exocet too. And we don't use Exocet against you.
Do you feel that Aerospatiale has any responsibility for the death of those sailors and soldiers?
Maybe not more than you, because as you said, the part of the Exocet is in the part built in Great Britain is in the Exocet.
In November last year, after a brief embargo, France resumed Exocet deliveries to Argentina. For some, it was bitter news.
Have you been in touch with relatives of other men who died on the Glamorgan?
Yes, I have. Yes, we've met and corresponded.
How do they feel about the fact that more Exocets have gone to Argentina since the war?
I haven't asked them this question. I think they must be as sick as I am.
In the mid-1970s, Argentina pursued her Falklands claim forcefully. The Franks report sets it out in detail. In February 1976, an Argentinian destroyer fired on the British research ship Shackleton, just south of the Falklands. The next month, there was a military coup in Argentina. The new junta's troops then took over southern Thule in the British South Sandwich Islands. And they wouldn't leave, but that didn't stop the arms traffic. Britain, along with allies like America and France, continued to supply weapons. We fitted out Argentina's aircraft carrier for electronic warfare. We sold her military aircraft parts and engines for light bombers. We also sold her Tiger Cat anti-aircraft missiles. The missiles are made by Short Brothers Belfast. Shorts sold them blowpipe anti-aircraft missiles as well. Here's something else from the Falklands. The stencil is in Spanish, but the label is English. It says Grantham, England. Behind it, the story of another consignment of arms.
Grantham is the Prime Minister's hometown in Lincolnshire. It is a busy market town. On Grantham's outskirts, a large factory. It's called British Manufacture and Research Limited. You might think it makes parts for computers. In fact, it is one of Britain's few private arms manufacturers, a subsidiary of the Swiss firm Oerlikon. Speciality, anti-aircraft guns and ammunition. Until being made redundant from the firm last year, Noel Angel had worked here for 21 years. Do you recognize this label?
Yes, it's a British Manufacturing Research Company label, Grantham, England.
That label came off of these crates of ammunition, captured from Argentine troops at Goose Green. Do you recognize that ammunition?
Yeah, 35 mil.
Was that made here?
Grantham. Well, Grantham and its subsidiary at Falklands War.
Do you have any idea how large the contract was to provide ammunition for Argentina?
Well, the general conversation on the company was that there's 88 lots of ammunition in the order and 10,200 rounds per lot.
So how many shells would that be?
Well, between 900,000 and 1 million.
And how much would they be worth?
Well, close on, I would assume, £50 million.
We now look at what happened just before Argentina invaded the Falklands. On March 2nd, according to Franks, the British Defence Attaché in Buenos Aires told London that Argentina might land forces on one of the islands. On March 3rd, Mrs. Thatcher called for contingency plans. Within the next few days, Franks says, the Foreign Office told Rex Hunt, the governor of the Falklands, we are now perilously near confrontation. Mrs. Thatcher asked John Knott, the Defence Secretary, how quickly ships could be got to the South Atlantic. There was public talk of the threat of war, a bout of table-banging at diplomatic level, the threat of worse to come. Well, you might have thought it was time to think again on arms deliveries, but not so. In fact, a British firm dealt with another order. A certain foreign government wanted essential parts for its anti-aircraft guns.
In early March, in the usual production meeting with the head of department, an order for gun mounts was discussed. The unusual thing about that order was that the client's name was mentioned for the first time, and that client was Argentina.
A gun mount is the part of the gun that joins the barrel to the vehicle carrying it. We asked the Grantham firm about the Argentinian order. They would not comment, but emphasized that all arms exports have to have government approval. We also asked the company and government whether gun mounts had left Grantham for Argentina. They would not say. This is Sheerness in Kent, a port used for exporting British arms. On March 19th, the Argentinian ship Tierra del Fuego II took on cargo here. Among the dockers who loaded it were Dave Glock and Ed Horn. This is the ship's manifest, which we've obtained of the Tierra del Fuego. It says down here that 8 containers of military equipment were loaded on that ship. 5 of those containers were shipped by a company whose initials are BMRL. Now that company is British Manufacture and Research Limited in Grantham, England, and they make anti-aircraft gun mounts.
Well, we wouldn't have loaded if we knew it was going to Argentina. I mean, it was in the wind, basically, that there was this row brewing up out there, and we're still exporting military weapons out there to help them out. It's not on, is it?
We showed the dockers evidence of another consignment that had been shipped to Argentina. This document shows that Sea Dart missile spares from British Aerospace were also shipped out to Argentina.
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
Unbelievable.
That's meant to be our best missile that we've got. And we're exporting them willy-nilly to the enemy. I mean, there's a lot of our boys didn't come back.
The Franks Committee concluded that the government had no reason to believe Argentina was going to invade until March 31st. That's just before they actually did so Critics have said that verdict is a whitewash. The government may not have known the actual date of the invasion, they say, but it certainly should have known one was at hand. Well, let's look at the 2 weeks immediately before the invasion. The now famous Argentinian scrap metal man landed here in South Georgia on March 19th. Shots were fired, the Argentinian flag was raised, and British observers could also see the so-called civilian scrap metal men were using a military-type helicopter. The civilian scrap men also had a landing craft. In fact, the Argentinian military were in there too. Behind the scrap metal man in this picture is Alfredo Astis, a naval captain with a public record as a special operations killer. Well, London also knew that Argentina's 2 modern British-built destroyers had been stationed off South Georgia. But the arms deliveries went on. On March 25th, an Argentinian Air Force jet left Stansted in Essex with military cargo. On March 29th, that's 4 days before the invasion, an Argentine Airlines plane flew out of Heathrow loaded with military spares. It looks like a major bungle, but an explanation is on offer. We talked to Sir Frank Cooper about Ministry of Defence thinking in the first part of March. He says that an early invasion was not foreseen.
I think the general expectation at that time was that he would get to be another round of discussions with the Argentine at the political level, and that the real difficulties were more likely to occur in the summer than at the time they did.
By the end of the next week, an Argentine landing party had established itself on South Georgia, and yet British arms were still going to Argentina. Do you think they should have been stopped then?
No, I don't. I think at that stage it would have been provocative. But, I mean, these, again, were existing contracts which were being fulfilled. And they were not major arms sales in the kind of sense that I think you've been putting it to me. I don't see that as a real situation. But at the time, it was thought that these people who had made an illegal landing would, be removed and disappear.
The last shipment was on the 29th of March from Heathrow Airport. Now, that was only 3 days before the invasion.
I mean, again, I would quote Franks back at you, that the British government had no reason to suppose until the 31st of March, which by my reckoning is 2 days after the 29th, that there was going to be an invasion.
During the war, Argentina used British weapons against British troops with some effect. Their blowpipes are believed to have brought down at least 1 Harrier here and 2 helicopters elsewhere. In San Carlos water, bombers with British engines attacked the British fleet. Well, how did British servicemen feel about being attacked with British arms? Ed Harriman talked to friends and relatives of the dead and to an RAF man who survived.
This captured anti-aircraft gun is now in a hangar in England. It is of the type used to fire the British ammunition which came from Grantham. Squadron leader Bob Iveson was flying over Goose Green when the anti-aircraft fire came up.
I had 2 thumps, large thumps somewhere down the back end of the aircraft, which rocked the aircraft sideways. The controls went slack and then stopped working altogether. Very shortly after that, flames entered the cockpit and I left. Pulled the ejection seat handle and got out.
We showed Bob Iveson the photograph of the anti-aircraft ammunition from Grantham.
How do you feel about the fact that you were fired at by British-made ammunition? I don't think really when you're being shot at by someone it's of even the passing interest of who made the ammunition at the time.
At Goose Green, the Argentinian guns were used in an unconventional role. With barrels lowered, they were fired straight at advancing British paratroops. In the battle, 15 British soldiers were killed. Officially, the paratroops say they would rather not talk about the matter. But some relatives have told us they find it incomprehensible that Britain had armed the enemy. One officer on HMS Glamorgan knew that his ship would soon be facing Argentinian forces armed by Britain. Lieutenant David Tinker wrote to his parents about the unwelcome prospect.
Gradually, I think, as they went south, they got more and more information about the stuff which had been given to the Argentinians.
How did David feel about this?
Well, he felt it was both ridiculous and disgraceful that potential enemies of Britain had been supplied so fully.
Today, Argentina remains Britain's enemy. She won't give up her long-standing claim to the Falklands, and she's busy rearming. In European shipyards, a small armada, 2 submarines, 4 frigates, 6 corvettes, and 5 fast patrol craft are being built for the Argentinian Navy. Britain's involvement in one of these shipbuilding deals has led her into an awkward dilemma.
This is Hamburg, West Germany. In the harbor, 4 frigates are being fitted out for Argentina. They cost over £100 million apiece and will be delivered within the next year. Their capabilities have impressed even those in Germany critical of Argentina's naval buildup.
These are highly sophisticated warships. They are more modern than what we have in the German Navy at the moment. They have armament from Italy. They have electronics from the Netherlands. And they try to get the best engines from Great Britain.
The problem with the engines is this. Under contracts negotiated 5 years ago, long before the Falklands War, Britain agreed to supply those warships with gearboxes, control systems, and engines. Those engines were to come from Rolls-Royce. Despite the war and the loss of life, Britain is steadfastly sticking to the contract she agreed. As a result, British engines are being fitted to warships that may, if Argentina tries again, soon be bombarding British troops in the Falklands. Banker Tony Killick, who helped to arrange the 1970s warship deal, sets out the commercial case for sticking to the German contract.
How do you explain the fact that the British government has given Rolls-Royce permission to deliver engines to the frigates being built in Hamburg for the Argentine Navy since the Falklands War?
The commercial contract for the sale of the Rolls-Royce engines to the Argentinians to be placed in their vessels was in fact signed in 1978. It would be very, very wrong for a government to interfere in a commercial contract, or in other words, to permit or ask a commercial company to renege on a contract. After all, we are a trading nation, and this, an action by a government in this country to interfere in a contract could have severe repercussions around the world in our other trading activities.
Others argue that Britain's usual practice in deals like this has been more flexible. Professor Tinker offers some examples.
Well, in the past, Britain has certainly not implemented contracts when the international climate was adverse. For example, in our disputes with Iran, in our disputes with Egypt, and even when we were, by supplying arms to different parties, getting involved in international disputes, we have withheld arms.
Britain could still try and stop the ships going. Actual delivery of the warships to Argentina is some way off.
Why can't we simply sabotage that by breaking the contract to deliver the engines?
Well, it would be, I think, a question of breaking our arrangements with the Germans as well as with the Argentinians, through which it is not a direct relationship, of course. But if we did that, the Germans would simply get engines from somewhere else.
Some Germans think Britain's decision on the engines is commercial logic carried to extremes. Norbert Gansel says the sending of the engines has baffled Britain's allies abroad.
Well, of course, it's difficult for a German government to explain to its population or to the workers in the shipyards that these ships should not be given to Argentina, being a potential military enemy of Great Britain, when Great Britain itself starts to send parts for these ships to Germany.
And British officials feel very strongly that once a contract has been signed, it must be kept.
I don't want to make my answer too easy, but you have to decide what is more important, industrial interest or peace, or the life of British soldiers or profit.
Others too feel the risk of war is more important than commercial agreements. Hugh Tinker.
How do you feel knowing that those engines have gone to Hamburg?
Well, it makes me feel sick. My son was killed by one machine with British technology in it, and I'm horrified to think that other young men might also die because of Britain supplying technology to our enemies.
Today, Argentinian planes are probing British airspace around the islands. Britain continues to count the human and material cost of the war and of maintaining Fortress Falklands. It's a strange irony that Britain and her allies helped arm an enemy for war. and are now in the process of doing so again. Good night.